on the other hand, as Eagle has said, and thank you, Eagle, for so eloquently put the role of the editor and the peer reviewer, etc., in the scholarly publishing arena. It is extremely important that we realize what is the role of the editor. So in that regard, it sort of overshadows of what I had to do this morning. I will try to make it as interesting as possible, and I sincerely hope that you will benefit from this presentation and that you will understand perhaps the code better and why we established the code and what is the role that it plays within the scholarly publishing forum and as well as in scholarly publishing, not only in South Africa, but internationally as well. And after all, we are international players too. And it is important that we do align with what's happening in the world out there. So this is the ASAF Code of Best Practice. This is the 2018 version, and I will mainly speak about what is being said in this code so that one can understand why it's being said and why we are highlighting those aspects within the code as such. I thought I'm just going to step back a little bit. I don't think we question often enough really what is a code of best practice. So a code of best practice is a procedure that has shown by research and experience to produce optimal results and that is established or proposed as a standard suitable for widespread adoption. It's also then in this regard that we have established the ASAF Code of Best Practice so that we can maintain a particular procedure and that we can also assist editors to maintain this procedure. And this code has been established by research and by experience. If we look back at the history of the Scholarly Publishing Unit and ASAF, it has been going for almost 14 years. And through the years, we have gathered actually quite a lot of experience and bringing them together into a little booklet so that we can ensure that there are results and that we establish it well. Well, at the end of my presentation, I will show you whether if this code has actually been established within the work and the editorial workflow of editors so that we can align and then with international and widespread practices as such. Now, does the Code of Best Practice enhance and promote then quality assurance? So, scholarly publishing occurs in an environment, and I think this is very important, of really compelling. It's highly loaded, not only with scholarly, but economic, political, and financial interests, and specifically in South Africa, where publishing in accredited journals actually brings about quite a huge amount of subsidy for the universities as a whole. And all these factors, scholarly, economic, and political and financial, actually competes with each other, and which might not actually be aligned with each other. And I think that's very important. And I think that is the tension between these different issues and interests that brings about and manifests itself into scholarly publishing. So then to foster an ethical and sustainable and efficient publishing system, that's what we're trying to do ultimately within ASAF, so that there are informed decisions and then strongly guided editorial processes so that we can manage these interests. So that is very important in how we view the code of conduct of ASAF within the scholarly publishing system. So it will help not only to establish a research output format of integrity, because after all, that is what's very important, and I think Eagle actually highlighted it very eloquently, but also to raise the quality of research publishing. Those of you who have attended the previous webinar, the first one, I did try to show that there are two tensions in the research output policy. So the one is it definitely raised the research output in South Africa enormously, and I think to the benefit of South Africa. But what it did do, it's really raising some serious questions about the quality of research publishing in South Africa, and that we are proving and that we see that there are more questionable practices happening because of the financial incentive which are then awarded to institutions because of their research outputs. So this is very important. So good publication practices will only become recognized and implemented if they are actively endorsed by all stakeholders in the scholarly publishing system. Now, this is a very important point, and I will show right at the end of my presentation. I will ask the question, to what extent are editors currently actually adhering to the Code of Best Practice? Are they actively endorsing the criteria and the values which are being expressed in the code? But I will leave that answer right to the end just to give you a quick demonstration of what we have found to date. And then the challenges, of course, that we are facing is to ensure that it's actively endorsed and implemented by editors. The codes of best practice are also necessary for journals to be visible and respected in the international landscape. Regional journals, journals from the South, are really questioned by the rest of the world. It is our responsibility to ensure that we are the best quality and that also the practices that we implement and that we execute are to the international standards. And that is important to be a full-fledged role player in the world of scholarly publishing. Sorry, and now my presentation is battling to advance. Let's just try something else. Apologies, colleagues. There you go. I'm on to the next one. So we're talking about the ASAP codes of best practice. And sometimes it is viewed, you know, why is ASAP doing this? And what are the other codes of best practice? And are there codes of best practices out there? So I'm not giving a full and detailed outline of codes of best practices, but I'm just giving you perhaps an idea of with certain of levels of codes within the system, meaning international, Africa, and then South Africa. I think the most known one is the one from the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE, the Directory of Open Access Journals, the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association, NOASPA, and the World Association of Medical Editors. So these three organizations have come together and they have published a code of best practice which is called Principles of Transparency and Best Practice in Scholarly Publishing. This is quite an international resource that editors actually refer to, and if they're in trouble and they've got some questions and issues, specifically the Committee on Publication Ethics Code, they have a particular service and one can go and look at what they have encountered over years and other journals have encountered over years, and one can see whether there, between the question and answer section, is if there's not perhaps a solution to a problem you might face, but they also live answer some questions should you pose it to them. These institutions are quite known for their work in open access, and because open access actually poses such an openness for people to do unethical practices. Predatory journals also have capitalized on open access journals and the notion of openness to broaden their work and to infiltrate sort of the scholarly publishing arena. And then, of course, then you get your predatory practices and unethical practices, and that have tainted sort of the world of open access journals. We found it also in our IAP committee. We had to defend for open access journals quite heavily because there were members of that committee that felt very strongly that open access is the main sort of driver of unethical practices and predatory practices. But I think what we did recognize is the fact that we have to have very strong and established code of best practices within open access journals, and editors of such journals need to adhere to very strong ethical and research integrity criteria and practices as such to ensure that we do not fall under this particular criticism. I think the biggest criticism I can put against this code of best practices is to look at what legal status, if I can put it that way, what status do these codes actually carry in the world of scholarly publishing. In this case of these organizations, you cannot become a member if you do not endorse the principles within in this code. And also each of these organizations have in-depth codes of best practices which you have to adhere to. So that's the closest we can come to what is sort of the role and what is the status of these codes. And as said, you cannot become a member of any of these organizations if you do not enter into some sort of commitment that your journal or your organization actually subscribes to the research integrity and ethical standards of that organization. So that was very interesting in this regard. Then if we look at commercial publishing houses, because we ask a lot of questions about them, and Wiley Blackwell, for instance, have the best practice guidelines on publication ethics, which is also a very good and handy guide to publication ethics. But again, I ask the question, how do they enforce this? If your journal does not adhere to these publication ethics, do they kick that journal off the platform, or do they go into a program where they mentor and they support them to actually reach sort of the ultimate standard within those best practice guidelines? So this remains interesting questions. If we look at Africa, there's Africa Journals Online, who has a journal publishing practice and standards framework. It is quite an extensive evaluation system. It takes very long. There are 6 ratings that you can actually fall into. They evaluate all the titles on their platform, and I think at the moment they almost have 700-800 titles, so it takes quite the time to gain some status within that framework. I think what is very interesting of these ratings is that you can progress from an inactive title to a new title, to no stars, to 1 star, to 2 stars, and then of course the ultimate is 3 stars. The evaluation is quite in-depth, and they give back the results, and that gives the editors at least an opportunity to rectify some issues and then to apply again. I cannot remember, I think after 3 or 4 years that you have been in a certain category, you can reapply for the next level within their 6 rating system. Which is good. The 3 stars, then at least you receive a badge that indicates to the world that you are following all the criteria within their framework. It is quite a long list, and it's an intensive and a detailed list of what you have to comply with, but it's very clear, and one cannot doubt that this will contribute eventually, if all the journals have been evaluated, to a good standard of journals within that platform and within that databases. Then, of course, in South Africa, as of the CHE, the DHET, Science and Technology, NRF and USAF did issue a statement on ethical research and scholarly publishing practices in 2019. It's a 1-pager. It really addresses the main issues in terms of research integrity and ethics, which I think laid the foundation, or also sort of guides and should guide whoever is busy with research output, not only in journals, but when we actually get to other outputs as well, and conducting research in the environment, is that we should adhere to those standards, etc. As said, it's really just the main principles of ethical research that I touch upon. But then I want to stop at ASAF's Code of Best Practice in Scholarly Journal Publishing, Editing and Peer Review, which is our 2018 version of our Code of Best Practice. This falls under the remit of the Scholarly Publishing Program, and of course, looking at all our other sub-products like Colisa Journals or Cielo South Africa, they all are adhering to this Code of Best Practice and even more. There are even more criteria to which journal editors should comply with. So again, what is the status of ASAF's Code of Best Practice? Again, it's voluntarily. There's not any other measurements that we have put into place to ensure that the Code of Best Practice is actually adhered to, and we welcome any thoughts of how we could perhaps install this business much better into the editorial processes of journals. But that is under discussion then for this group and the National Scholarly Editors Forum. Just to step back a little bit more, so how did this start? How did we decide, and how did it come that ASAF actually is playing such a role in the Codes of Best Practice scholarly journal publishing? It started actually way back when a report was published in March 2006, which was called The Strategic Approach to Scholarly Publishing in South Africa. That report actually laid down a huge foundation for ASAF to operate on, and as I said, almost for 14 years now, we've been in the business, if I can put it as bluntly as that. So ASAF Council approved that a Committee on Scholarly Publishing in South Africa should be established. Very interesting enough, that's also how our unit, the Scholarly Publishing Unit, was established within the ASAF Secretariat, and that's why we're functioning under the auspices of the Academy of Science of South Africa. So in line with its mandate, the CSPI-SA, after it was established, it held a meeting of about 100 editors of South African scholarly journals in 2007. And this meeting had a threefold purpose, which had to be endorsed by the National Scholarly Editors Forum. And the then chair of the CSPI-SA felt very strongly that we must have full endorsement by the editors. If we don't have the support, we will not have any success in what we have to roll out under the recommendations of that report that was published in 2006. So the three issues that was dealt at that meeting was then to establish a National Scholarly Editors Forum under the auspices of the Academy, and that's why you're part of this particular group, and thank you very much for participation. And then secondly is then the National Code of Best Practice in Editing and Peer Reviewing, in order to strengthen the system, because way back in 2006 and even in our 2018 report, we still find that that the system of journals in South Africa is still dwindling in some respects. And therefore, the third point is very important, and I will not speak about that specifically today, and I think this is for another discussion. But the third point was then to get the willingness of the editors to participate in periodic discipline group peer review of their journals. Then as to a preparatory step, inter alia to increase government support for open access publishing of national journals, which has not happened yet. But we hope that when the open science policy will be released by the Department of Science and Innovation, it is already being discussed at ministers' level, is that will open a door where we can have some concrete discussions on open access publishing in South Africa, and specifically the support then to national journals. But that is still quite a huge debate and discussions that will have to take place. So the National Code of Best Practice in Editorial Discretion was drafted and finalized, and then by the input of the NSF was approved. published in 2008 and then endorsed by the Council in 2008. So that was version 1. It was known as the National Code of Best Practice in Editorial Discretion. But then in 2018, because of the change in scholarly landscape, we decided to revise it, and it's now known as the Code of Best Practice in Scholarly Journal Publishing, Editing, and Peer Review. So that is really just by way of introduction. I think we sometimes miss these things and I wonder where they come from, and I hope I have contextualized why ASIF is pushing so much for the best of the Code of Best Practice in Scholarly Publishing. So if we look at the outline of the code, and I'm really being self-critical here, and we always have to be critical about the work we do. It has 5 sort of broad headings. It speaks about the fundamentals of research publishing, about the editorial process, the editorial policy, the editorial board and governance, and the peer review process. And as I said right at the end, I will be further critical to say, and maybe I can let the cat out of the bag to say that I really think that we again need to revise the Code of Best Practice because again of the change in the scholarly publishing environment and the issues and the challenges that we actually face, particularly in South Africa, is that we need to start addressing that as well. We did an in-depth analysis of the review reports of the peer review panels that we conducted. We've come to the end of that process now. So we really dissected the recommendations to see what is being recommended by the peer reviewers to the journals, and that will inform us in revising the new Code of Best Practice. But let's proceed. As I said, it started off with the fundamentals of research publishing. And I think, again, this is very important. And we must also remember that the Code of Best Practicing is not a document on its own standing loose from a broader framework of research output. The Code of Best Practice actually taps into and plugs very nicely into the Department of Higher Education's research output policy. So it dovetails to many extents and speak to each other. And then again, if we look at the Code of Best Practice, it dovetails into the other work that ASIF is doing, for instance, Yellow South Africa and the criteria there. So while there's duplication amongst these different systems, or if I can brand them that way, we must not see them that they stand alone. They all speak to each other to be coherently interpreted. But this first point is very important, and this is very repetitive, again, between the research output policy and the Code of Best Practice. And that is that reported findings, conceptual insights, must be original. So what do we mean by that? That in a sense, that there are novel findings or insights that are not published elsewhere. And this is quite a loaded sentence, because it does sort of prompt and indicates to an editor the importance of a publishing agreement between the author and the editor or / the journal. Even in our work that we do through the SHIS, we have many a time where the author said, but I did not agree, I am not the co-author, or I did not contribute to that article. And then in the back end of all the editorial processes, how to find a way to rectify that situation. And that can only be stopped or prohibited if there's a publishing agreement between the author and the actual journal, because in that way it also covers yourself legally should there be very serious problems in your journal. So authors have to certify that the paper submitted is not under consideration by another publication. I'm quite sure if I ask you to put up your hands right now, I will find many evidence where such duplication has actually taken place. And then the trouble and the effort to try and navigate between 2 or even 3 journals where a paper has been submitted. So this is quite a serious issue. And then that author, this is also very important, will not be, that article, manuscript will not be submitted to any other journal until a final rejection decision or formal withdrawal from the present journal has been received. So this is just about that relationship between an author and a journal, and that one have to secure that and ensure that the manuscripts does not jeopardize sort of the editorial processes of the actual journal by submitting to other journals as well. So I hope you find this quite useful. It continues under the fundamentals of research publishing to say, one must ensure that there's sufficient detail of the methods and the materials used in the study. That is also the premise on which manuscripts should be admitted to a journal for consideration. No apparent or inconsistent data should be omitted. It speaks about the citation. One must be very sure as to what format will you be using there. Is it APA or is it Harvard? And be clear about that in your author guidelines or in your policies, and to ensure that authors actually fairly cite. So this is also then a task for peer reviewers to be on the lookout for, or when they evaluate and peer review particular articles. Self-citation must be limited. Efforts should be made to ensure that reference is made to the first report of a finding. So you can see already there are some elements that should go into your author guidelines when you post such guidelines on your actual website. So colleagues, these are really what is being said in the Code of Best Practice of what's being considered as best practice in this regard. Just to continue a little bit further, one must give special attention to lead author. Authorship is a major problem within articles being accepted, and what authors want editors to do. We have many reports where editors actually say, well, what do I do in this instance? This is the situation. So one must be very careful when outlining who is the lead author, and then to only include authorship listings of persons who've made a significant contribution to the production of the work at an intellectual, practical, or conceptual level. And one has to be very clear in your layout and design when you mention all these things. International best practice shows that the more information you give about your author and in what circumstances was the research done, by which institution, who funded that research, was there any conflict of interest? It must be stated from the start. And then author affiliations should be provided which reflect. Now this is very important, both the period of the study and the present situation. We have so many times where the author requests that it has a long list of affiliations because they're moving an institution. But again, I would like to warn editors, please have a look at the research output policy. It's extremely clear as to how and what should be accredited, and I think editors should be guided by the research output policy as to how they lay out who was the main responsible, or who was the co-authors, and then if there's other practical and conceptual level input, that it is stated that the experiments were done by A, B, and C. And the conceptual input to this whatever was by D, E, and F. Because it has implications, not only for your institution, but also for the DHET. So when you apply for accreditation for that author, as to what will be considered as the sort of the legal basis of the authorship as well as the funding to that institution. It has huge implications. So one has to be very careful as to how you craft authorship within the particular articles. Some are not that difficult, but I know of many editors that have where we have had discussions where this is a major problem, and one has to be very clear, and it has to align. Sorry, I'm hearing. Yes.
Yes, that's Egil saying a couple of minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Egil, just tell me exactly how many more minutes do I have?
1 or 2 would be good.
Sure, I am concerned. Okay, right, let me try. And then, of course, it's very important when you look at the date of acceptance of an article, one has to be very clear when was it accepted, when was it received, when was it published, and that also indicates to your readers and your end users as to sort of the turnaround time in your actual sort of your editorial processes, etc. And then it speaks about editorial processes, and here it is a very short piece within the Code of Best Practice. It really speaks about being open, not only to authors of multiple institutions, but the Africa continent, internationally. And then it stresses that the editorial process and policy is extremely important. And even in the research output policy, it states that you have to have an editorial policy in your journal. So if we look at the editorial policies, and the Code of Conduct is very rich as to what you should have in there. It speaks about the peer review. It speaks about the charges if you have article processing charges. And it highlights that you have to just be open about your work that you do, etc. So that people don't guess. Your end users, your reader, your evaluator does not have to guess as to how you run your particular journal. There's a whole list of editorial policies. They are really extensive policies, and they are very necessary. We find that if we get any comebacks, etc., it's mainly on the editorial policies, because that guides you as to how to govern your journal as such. It has quite a large piece on the editorial board. It tells you how you should reflect on your editorial board, how you should change, how you should appoint them. It doesn't say for how long, but it says competitively for a specific term. I think that's very important, that you have a turnaround on your editorial board. That will assure that you will at least bring in some new ideas, etc., within your journal, and it stimulates also the growth of your actual journal. It again highlights, in line with the research output policy, that submissions from editorial board members must be handled with extra confidentiality, and then it must be also clear in your guidelines on how you actually deal with if the editorial board submits a manuscript to the journal. I think that's very important because those things we find is the big problem. It speaks about the peer review process, quite some useful tips there. And it says that articles accepted for publication in the journal must be peer reviewed. I know that within different subject fields, there's double-blinded peer review or there's single-blinded peer review, but peer review as a practice are underlined and then again highlighted in the code, as well as in the research policy. It states that manuscripts must be peer reviewed. It also states, and it sort of allows then on which basis could you, can you publish an article, or where you should, and whether you could, sorry. And so there are sort of three bases, rejections. On which basis can you reject it? Some desktop rejection after peer review. It really sort of gives you a good outline on which basis you can do that. And of course, that editors reserve the right to reject papers without review. I think that's an important sort of endorsement of practices, because I also saw that editors are unclear about on which basis can they actually reject some papers. So, Eagle, sorry, I've maybe overstepped my time. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if I have 1 more minute, perhaps, just to very briefly show what we have found in our recommendations of our peer review panels. I will not go in detail. I just want to say that we have a basis on which we can actually revise the Code of Best Practice. So, thank you, Eagle. Over to you.
Susan, that would be excellent and very valuable. I know we're running a bit late from the beginning. We have made up a bit of time. And so please go ahead on that in a summary form. I think it would be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to give people sort of a flavor, because I'm quite sure editors might think, well, what is it exactly? Might feel that they are adhering to the Code of Best Practice. What is the problem? So let's just show you what is the problem. So what we did is we took all the recommendations of not all the reviews that have been conducted so far. We did a sample from all the reviews, from old and new, or from let me not say that, journals that have been long in terms of date of publishing, that they've been quite in the long run of things, and then journals, young journals of about 5 years that have been around. What are the typical things that they do not comply with? So if we look under the authors categorization, again, we still find that representativity, and we have broken it up in different levels, demographic, geographical, institutional representativity. There are still some major problems. It would not appear on this list if we did not consider it as important. There was a factor being built in to show, to highlight the major problems. So we did not list all the problems. And then in terms of governance, as you can see, I've already spoken about it, and it's still a problem within editors and the governance of journals. Author guidelines, not visible, not comprehensive enough. Permissions, author agreements in place. Editors don't have that. And can I just put the offer out there? We do have an agreement that we can share with you. It has been compiled by a legal person at the University of Cape Town. It has been tested, and it works very well. Then if we look at the editorial board, again, representativity, same categories, institutional, demographic, geographical, governance. There's not proper policies in place which governs and guides the editor when decision-making has to take place. Roles and responsibilities. There's confusion amongst editorial board members as to what is their role. I must say, in the world, editorial advisory boards, editorial teams, editorial boards, those terms are conflated many a time. And I think what we need to do is actually understand what is the role of the editorial team and what is the role of the editorial advisory team, etc. It's up to that journal to decide what is it. Just to give you more flavor, of course, the coverage, thematic, methodological coverage, scope and focus of the journal. There is mission drift, and we've seen that. Sometimes the scope says something, but they publish something else, or they go much wider than their focus in order to solicit some manuscripts for that particular journal. And that also poses a problem. Special editions, editorials, the importance thereof. Again, the editor, the policy for the editors, what policies are in place. And I'm almost done, Madam Chair. So you can see it's a broad flavor of issues, editorial policies, there were a lot of complaints about that it is not in place, it's not comprehensive, and that sort of opens up a world of uncertainty, and sort of trust is compromised because it's not in place. Peer review, very important. There were a lot of complaints about peer review that's inconsistent within journals, and that it compromises the quality. You get good articles in a particular journal, or even some bad ones. So the consistency of peer review and the quality that it should bring about, then again was highlighted in that. And I'm almost done, Madam Chair. You can see criteria for evaluation, support for peer reviewers, there's nothing. And then the representativity of even peer reviewers. There was mentioning that there's also problems, and that it sort of transpires in the actual content. Technical aspects, websites of journals are not that well and not well constructed. And so one will have to focus on the technical aspects as well. And then just, of course, the best practices. Most of our journals said, well, they do know about it, but they do not really implement it as such, etc. And I think that will really bring me to the end of sort of the flavor of the best practices which are still not being adhered to, although we have this code that do speak to most of these things which are still problematic. And then the publication ethics that came out quite on the top of the list, because we are getting questionable practices more and more. I'm sitting with 3 major issues on my desk about predatory publishing, hijacking of journals, which is new. Just suddenly a surge of those things again. So just a warning that we have to be careful. Madam Chair, thank you very much for giving me some more opportunity, but I hope that has been helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Igor, you are muted.
I noticed that there are a number of questions about whether the table is available to the editors, and could a copy be circulated or made available, please? Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Igor. Yes, I suppose we could. It is sort of still a little bit of our, how would I put it, so we'd like to inform, we'd like that table to inform us in terms of the work that we still be doing. Just give us an opportunity is how we could perhaps make it in a more palatable format for our editors. But certainly I do understand there's a lot of value in that table. It took a couple of years to sort of dissect the recommendations of the peer review results. So you can imagine that we've put a lot of work into it, and it still needs to sort of inform us in going ahead. But certainly let's have a look at something that we can at least put out to the editors. Thank you.
Thank you. And certainly there will be a recording available to which one could refer. There are some questions which we'll hold over. It's an absolute joy to introduce 3 panelists, and I'd like them to unmute and say hello just after I've introduced them, and see if you can start your video. So Prof. L.B. Henning is a professor of educational linguistics in the Department of Childhood Education at the University of Johannesburg's Soweto campus. She has held a fellowship from the National Academy of Education in the USA for teacher development in informal settlement communities in the 1990s at Stanford University. She is the editor-in-chief of the South African Journal of Childhood Education. LB, could you unmute and say hello?
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for introducing me, Igra. And do you want to see my video as well?
Yes, if you can try turning it on. Okay, I understand. Then we'll go on audio. Dr. Naomi Nkela is senior lecturer in the Department of English in the Division of Languages at the University of the Witwatersrand. She is the editor-in-chief of Imbizo, International Journal of African Literary and Comparative Studies, published by the UNISA Press. And her own research centers on African feminist literature. She is co-editor of the book Gendered Violence and Human Rights in Black World Literature and Film, published just 2 years ago. She has a particular ability in teaching language and literature to first entry students.
Thank you, Igor. Good morning, colleagues.
Great to see you. Thank you. And then Professor Mark Cotton is Emeritus Professor at Stellenbosch University. He is has been a Distinguished Professor of Pediatrics and a pioneer in the area of children living with HIV. He is the Editor-in-Chief of the Southern African Journal of Infectious Diseases and an extremely distinguished editor on our panel. Professor Mark, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. And I've already learned a great deal in this webinar. Thank you, and realize how much work we've got to do.
Great. May I ask each of you to give perhaps 4 or 5 minutes on your views? And I do have 3 questions to ask the panel after that. So may I ask you to be concise in your general views on the best practices and suggestions looking forward in particular. So let's start with Professor Albie Henning. Over to you. Hello, Albie. We are not hearing you at present. Right. Professor Naomi, may I move over to you and ask for general views on the way forward for the best practices code?
Is that before we answer the 3 questions?
Yes, if that's all right, unless
Okay.
you'd like to take up any of them now.
Okay, let me give a general view because I do think what Susan presented is good work, but always there's room for some more of those best practices to actually guide the work that we do. I think publishing is very complex and some of the things we take for granted, but we do need a code that helps editors to manage some of the complexities that they encounter, but also not to be overly restrictive because journals are different. So I would say more work needs to be done on that best code document. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Professor Mark, may I move over to you to hear your general views on the code and any particular answers to questions?
No, thank you very much. So basically, I think the code is good, and I think we do our best to comply with everything on it, and certainly agree with everything on it. I must say that our journal was the chief editor was Professor Charles Feldman for 20 years, and is still available for consultation and sharing his views and institutional memory. And I think having experienced people who one can turn to for complex issues is always a good thing. I think that's just all I want to say at this stage. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. And may I see if Professor Albie is there?
I'm here now. A video
Great.
from your side.
General
It says
views?
that, hello?
Hello. I
Yes.
can hear you fine.
I can hear you fine too. Thank you. The sign I get from Zoom is that I cannot start my video because the host has stopped it. So you can't see my face, but here I'm saying something. I think the code has done a lot of good work. especially for new editors. I can see that. It's also done some good work for the governing bodies at the place where the journal is published. In our case, it's a commercial publisher, but the editorial office is at the University of Johannesburg. And so I think it serves a very good purpose. And personally, in my experience as an founding editor of 2 journals, and I might just also tell the world that at last we found a new available editor for our journal, because I don't think it's healthy that a journal should have a founding editor going on and on. So now we have somebody, and I think the code can have some revision. And when you ask us the specific 3 questions, I'll respond to that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So may I ask each of you the first question about the key best practices being applied in your journal? Professor Albie, can I start with you?
Yes, certainly. The good thing about our journal is that all communication is documented meticulously before it even gets to the editor to send out to review or to make a decision as a desk rejection or suitable for review. Our desk review often goes out with suggestions for resubmission. I think that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. And what we've also learned, and this comes from about 10 years ago when the first rogue journals showed their faces somewhere in Asia, that we search on Scholar Google and on Scopus for the authors who have submitted before we think about sending it out for review, so that we have an idea if this is, first of all, not something that has some echo in the past, that it is, in fact, an original piece, and also that it fits the type of genre in which the author has written, just for a sense of authenticity. And I must say, sometimes when we do that, I feel a little bit like a detective, which is not something I like. But I've learned the very hard way from long ago, pre the Beals list even, that one has to check in as many ways as possible, especially if the mail comes from a Gmail or a mail that isn't obviously associated to a place where one does research, although one can't disqualify people because of their email address. And then also what is really good for us is that we now have a really large pool of reviewers, something 400 or 500, but even they are overburdened because many people use them. We have, I think, a very reliable way of checking for initial plagiarism, direct plagiarism. And if we find it, we tell the author and ask them to try again and to paraphrase and so on. We advise, because although we don't use the APA system in the journal, the advice that I and my colleagues hand out usually comes from the 7th edition of APA's publication. And then we have section editors. They stay for 3 years, which will share the administration of the review process, but the editor and the section editors together decide whether an article is, a manuscript is publishable. And then we also have now an emphasis on the inclusion of data analysis processes of specifically qualitative research in the methods section, because we have found through the years that I love qualitative research. It's my my preferred methodologies. But there's always this is where I went, these were the people, and this is what I found, with no evidence of data. So now we have set an example of not accepting such journals and asking for resubmission. Those are some of the good things that I think we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do see the role of the editor as partly in author education and advice. Professor Naomi, may I ask you the same question? What key best practices are you applying?
Thank you, Eagle. So my journal is Imbizo, which is a journal of African literary studies. And Susan spoke about the confusion around the role of the editorial board and the editorial advisory board. Now, here's the thing. We have an editorial board and an international advisory board. And for many years, our international advisory board was really dominant. So we had a lot of names there, but those people didn't do any work for the journal. And so we had a huge problem where our peer reviewing was taking 6 to 8 months, because literally I had to go onto Google Scholar to find people who have published on specific texts, because we do literature. So for example, if someone has published on Things Fall Apart, then I'm looking for the latest authors on that text to be able to assign peer reviewing. Now, last year or the late 2021, we had a meeting with UNISA Press, who are the publisher, and it was very interesting when they advised us to say, instead of having this huge database of over 300 peer reviewers on our system, why don't we make use of our international advisory board? So I had to literally take about 2 months to say, okay, these people on this board don't do any work for us. Why don't we find the people who have a commitment to the journal? I think that is very key when it comes to peer reviewing. So we look for a selection of about 50 people. So currently we have 52 on that list. People who have supported the journal over many years, they have a commitment to African literature, and they are now part of our international advisory board. And we send them letters. We said, if you would peer review maximum of 2 articles per year for us, then as a token of appreciation, you get free access to the 2 issues published for that year. And I promise you, the result was so positive. Like every single person said, yes, I'm happy to do it. And now our turnaround time is 2 to 3 months. Before we had 6 to 8 months. So it's been a massive progress for us in the Mbizo Journal. And I really think that is one of the best ways to maximize some of these boards we have, instead of them just sitting there as white elephants. I think the second thing I would say before I hand over to you back, Igor, is to really make sure that the role of the editor-in-chief is not just a delegation duty. So internationally, one of the best practices internationally is for editors to really take time, read articles, reject some upfront, not even send them out for peer reviewing. And I think that's something we used to neglect in the past, because we're a struggling journal. We only got accredited in 2019. But last year, we did realize that by doing that, we were making maximum use of our human capital resource, because we don't want to waste peer reviewing resources for articles that just are not even close to being publishable. And also, the tricky part is when you send articles back to authors and say, please revise according to the peer reviewers' recommendations. Sometimes authors are tricky and they just do a cosmetic change. Now, the editor needs to really check that those corrections have been done, not cosmetic changes, because still quality assurance is very, very important. So based on those 2 things, I think our journal is really making great strides in the past year and this year as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations on getting the turnaround time down that much, and also on getting the board and the editor-in-chief, of course, to do a great deal of the work. Professor Mark, what are the key practices that you have in place?
No, thank you. So we have quite a good technical check that starts off to check that that the documentation is fine, that it's not been submitted anywhere else, that there's ethics approval. What then happens is that we have a desk review, and I agree that I think this is a very important part, and I think we see ourselves as often the first port of publication for emerging researchers and people that have done theses and really want them to publish. Often the standards and the submissions, despite having some merit, can be really bad. And then that's under those circumstances, I send them back with some hopefully constructive criticism and ask to resubmit. I think that stage is an issue. I think in our infectious diseases community, one of the strengths is that we know one another quite well, and have a fair idea of who's available, who's got expertise. I do think that finding reviewers can be very challenging despite that. And I've just, from the previous speaker, I've got some tips now on how to address that. So I think structurally, we're a smallish community of an important topic, know the subject well, and are very motivated for African publications in our area.
Thank you very much. I think the whole quality of knowing the community very well in terms of both authors and reviewers is coming through loud and clear. Prof. Elby, may I ask you on the next question, what other best practices would you like to introduce going forward? What looks key here?
First of all, I always spend a lot of time personally before, even if an article, manuscript has been accepted, I spend a lot of time, because I can't help it, my editorial typing moves in. I want to help the author. And I've realized that this is an impossible situation because we receive very, very many manuscripts from new authors and from authors in different parts of the world where English as an academic or scholarly language is not that well known. And so I think if we can get together some funding, which we are trying to do, and appoint an internal language editor, not somebody at the publisher who looks at it right at the end, but in the interim, because reviewers try, very many kind reviewers spend a lot of time doing some editing work, and we really appreciate that. But that would be great to assist authors, especially new authors, to get into the publication arena and to have some support. So, and that was the aim, because when this journal started off 12 years ago, it was seen as a developmental journal and as part of the DHET's drive to make people aware of childhood education and teachers for childhood education. And so I would also like to see an increase in mixed methods research, because I think that's quite a healthy way to inspire people. I'm an educationist, so I always want to see not only the publication effect, but also the development of the author. And so we would also like to consult more with our advisory board. We do award some of the review work to them, but I think we need to increase that, and that will be helpful. And I'm very glad my colleague from Imbizo mentioned how much it meant to them. And then also I think we should have availability of the data that the research has presented in the manuscript, and to make that a requirement for original research, because we are in the era of open science. And so we would like to put together a repository space where the data can be deposited. And then I know this is almost impossible, but it's a dream to have at least 3 reviewers per manuscript, not because they might not agree if there are only 2, but because some just take far too long. And then we will take the first 2 and write to the third one and say, thank you, it's okay, we're done now. And then also to ensure that we stay, and I mean, it's very hard, but to stay aware of what OpenAI software can do, and to check our manuscripts coming in different ways. And I'm getting some advice of this from my colleagues at the university. Yes, and then what the best practice that I'm dreaming of at the moment is when our new editor, who is an esteemed South African scholar, will take over in a month or 3. And so that I can sit back and assist her, but just enjoy this journal as I enjoyed the previous one, Education has Changed, which was founded in 1997. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Naomi, may I move on to you? Additional best practices that you would like to see perhaps in the code?
Thank you, Igo. So in Imbizo, I think one of three things we're looking at. First is something Elizabeth just mentioned, the mentoring of young scholars. And because publishing is quite hard, so we have found the need to really mentor upcoming new PhD graduates to publish, so that we also have that diversity of voices in our journal, and so that we don't have the same people publishing all the time. And now African literature is a small field. And so then you get these same people who are experts in the field. And that is where the true meaning of peer reviewing comes in. So that when I want to assign peer reviewers for those, is somebody I know is a young PhD, newly graduated, or is still trying to get a PhD, submits an article, and then I want to find peers, like people who are also new into publishing, have had a PhD, have published one or two good articles, so that they can give real guidance and not kill the spirit of these young ones. So that kind of mentoring process is very demanding, but I think it's something to be encouraged in the field of scholarly publishing. The second one is really to make sure that we have a journal that follows its own policies. So, for example, the Imbizo journals stipulate 7,000 words maximum. In the past, we have been very lax about that. So we've published articles 8,000 plus. I think it's a problem because it delays production, because then the typesetter needs to change the whole thing, and the whole structure of the document, and that delays production. So I think one of the good things we want to do in Imbizo now is to really insist, if your work has been accepted, we need your work to be 7,000 words, because that's what our own policy says. So we can't flout our own policy. We've got to respect our own policy as a journal. And that is in line with international practice. I know international journals have insisted that I reduce my document, because in literature we tend to write 9,000, 10,000 words, but that doesn't cut it. We have to respect our own policies within a journal. And then the last thing is to say, maybe to get the pressure off of the editor sometimes. I think as Imbizo, we want to consider more of special issues. Special issues is not something we've often done. And so I think that's our target for 2023, 2024, to get special issues in, so that some of that pressure from the editors can be in place. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Professor Mark, additional items that you would like to see considered in the Code of Best Practice?
Yeah, look, what I see, what I think is really important is to focus on use of language and writing skills. I have an impression that well, people generally write quite badly, and very long-winded, and often in many cases the author English is not the first language, so it's actually really, really difficult. So I would like to see more efforts by the high institutions to really work on language and help the authors in this area, have lots of writing courses, so that what gets submitted is reasonably well written and is essentially as short as possible. We have, I think our word limit is about 3,500 words, and in many cases, I think one could make it even shorter. And the shorter and the better written it is, the more you can read in the time that you have to read. So I think that is probably the most important additional point that I think would really help publishing in the country.
Thank you very much. If I can move on to a third question, Professor Albie, do you think that these best practices advance trust in the process of science?
I would think so, for various reasons. Number one, if I submit a manuscript to a journal that I don't know, and I get response and I get attention from the editor in the desk review, and I am reminded by the administrator that not all the forms are there, and please submit the following, all the administration happens on time and meticulously, then at least we trust the process of publishing, number one. And then in the decision-making eventually, if there is evidence, good evidence, and we even use a chart to allocate some percentage for different parts of the article. If there's evidence that the editor and her reviewers and the section editors have attended to my work, then I will begin to trust the process. And I'd also say, what I found is that when new authors especially find out what your email address is, you start getting very many emails at the university asking you for advice and so on and so on. And that is something that I can deal with. I'm an older academic. This is more important to me to attend to the young people who are trying to learn, and also very many complaints. So if one responds, if an editor or the German journal's administrator or the editorial manager respond to people, that is already some trust. And if they can write in their list of corrections and so forth, that I don't agree with this, here's my rebuttal and why. And I think if authors have the sense of freedom that they can object to what you have found and take the step, the review process to another level, first review, second review, still I'm not happy, but I want to publish. All right, we give you a third chance, and in all fairness, tell us why. Then that advances science because the process works. Further to that, if an author reads our journal, reads the articles, and everything that is accessible on the website, and there's quite a lot, then they get a pretty good idea of where this journal is going and what they regard as important. And if they then recognize that some of their fellow students, researchers, professors in different parts of the world, if they start publishing here, it means that they also trust them. So we feel quite honored that we've had some articles published from authors in the country, which I still think has the best primary education in the world, which is Finland. Then they trust us. I think science is also not free. So if somebody is willing to pay the article handling fees or the institution helps them, then it means that they really believe that this works. It's not a question of I'm buying my article space. I am buying the attention of so many people who've worked on my article, right from the beginning, through the reviewing process, through the revisions, through the editing, and so much goes in that final level when a publication is edited and polished. Okay, I go back to my first statement previously. I think that is why if a journal offers opportunities, which we could for a few years, with a very special grant from the DHET and the European Union to present workshops for authors. Unfortunately, much of this was in the time of the pandemic because we actually planned it on site or to go to different institutions. But at least that I could see made a very big difference. But again, it required that we had to get some funding. And I think in my last few months as an editor, I'm going to apply not necessarily to the DHET. I can't apply to the NRF because I'm a SARCHI shareholder, so no money coming from there. But I'm going to take a big chance and approach one of the big foundations in the United States where I was once a postdoc, and ask them, have you got some spare money in that hard-ridden country where you live to just fund a little bit of author training? By the way, at UJ, Prof, we do, well, where I work in Soweto, we have workshops for authors working on articles all the time because they need that. But I would like to have a permanent, employed, remunerated, in-house editor to help help authors before they submit their manuscript. I think that's about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Prof. Naomi, additional remarks, perhaps on different aspects?
I'll add one thing to what Prof. Henning said. So I reflected a lot on the phrase, the process of science, and I think that's very important. I think as editors, we are, it's a big responsibility, but I think we really key in enforcing the process of science, and so that people can have trust in that process. And one of the ways to do that is to ensure that work, if people submit work, it must be quality work. I think authors are under enormous pressure. People want to get promotions, people want subsidy, and so there's a lot of work that is being submitted to journals that is really not worth reading. So somebody can just wake up and say African literature is not being decolonized, and send me a series of opinions, for publication in Imbizo. And I'm thinking, where is science in this work? I think up front, the person needs to understand that publishing is upholding the process of science. I need to see a research problem. What is the problem? I need to see that you have read the literature in that field. What do you understand about that field? Then show me where the gap is and what is the new knowledge you're bringing in. I think a lot of people are not thinking deeply about this process. And maybe when Elizabeth suggests workshops, people do need these workshops. But it appears to me that with the high rate of predatory journals out there where you can just submit work and within 2 weeks you are being told it's been accepted, people think anything passes for science. No, not anything passes for science. So if my journal says peer reviewing takes 3 to 6 months, I'm going to make sure peer reviewing takes 3 to 6 months. So if you are an author and you submit to my journal and I give you feedback in 3 months, you should be able to trust that this has gone through a thorough peer reviewing process. If you submit to a journal and you get feedback within 2 weeks, you should be thinking very seriously, is this a proper journal? Is this science that I can trust? So that's one of the things I think authors really need to understand. The science is a process, and that process needs to be upheld, most especially by editors. And so if we can make sure that happens, then I think people really truly believe that science is what it should be and that quality is important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Mark?
Yeah, so I think that we all have a major responsibility in ensuring scientific integrity. And I think our editorial panel, and we have between 2 and 3 and 4 members who meet on a weekly basis to assess and to discuss it. And I think it's really important to just adhere to all of these principles and to be open to genuine efforts, by the people submitting, to help them where one can, and also to be quite strict and to make sure that bad science is not published, basically. So I think that's, all I want to say.
Thank you very much indeed. Yep, I think that the editors do take on a major role in terms of the integrity of science. Right, I would now like to open the floor. There are already a number of questions, and I'm going to note that a question by Martin Nicol, who is guest editor for New Agenda, South African Journal on Social and Economic Policy, has largely been answered in terms of the responsibility of an editor in making a contribution more readable, or I'd like to check on your question, Professor Nicol, in terms of an unfavorable judgment from the ASAF peer review panel last year, that you have been studying the content of other approved journals in an effort to gauge the ASAF standards applied, and your comment that so much of what you've counted is awful, badly written, often unclear, frequently boring and uninteresting, and this is often in the open access publications. I'd like to bounce this question to you, Susan, if I may, because you have such a view over the field.
Yes, thank you, Igor. So let's look at that question. So it is about our peer review panels and the findings that were found in the review of that particular journal. Yes, and I think during the discussions by our panel members, and this has been raised to some extent, and it was also sort of said then whose responsibility is it? Is that we ensure that the quality of what we publish is of high standards and high quality. I really like sort of the approach of Naomi to say, we have to be strict. We cannot be just say, well, it's fine, let's just get that manuscript out or the article into the open just to be seen, etc. It does taint the journal. It does bring the quality down. It does sort of raise some trust issues. Can we, and some issues of, do we really want to publish with this journal? So this is quite a serious matter. And I did like Mark's remark where he said, well, I think there's two sides to it. Is that universities and the higher education should take more responsibility in giving tools or services to the editors to actually copy edit these articles. I think that would alleviate some problems on the one hand side. I do know, like Albert Henning, who has put in a lot of effort to better those articles. And I remember this particular case that we reviewed, and if I remember correctly, is that there were disparity. There were articles of good quality, but there were articles also of very low standard. And it wasn't just the language that was a problem. It was actually the level of the research. And again, so valuable what you said, Naomi, what is the research problem? How did you engage with the literature? How did you identify the gap? And through your analysis and methods and analysis, then how do you intend to address that gaps? And then what is the new way and what is the way when going forward? And that is lacking. And we do get experts on our panels. It is not ASAF or the Secretariat that is involved in the actual evaluation of these journals. We do get experts from the field where they engage with these journals, and they look at these journals holistically as to what is the quality, etc. There's a whole list of questions being asked and where these and how these journals are being evaluated. And sorry, Naomi, I'm picking on you, but you were subject to this peer review panel, and I think if I may reveal, I think the second time around that then you were approved. Exactly. But then what did that editor do with our recommendations? Went back to the drawing board, looked at what could be, what's helpful, what could be better. And when Imizwa applied again, they gave a full list of what did they do to rectify the situation. So, it is very easy to dish out sort of criticism, but, in line with what we're saying about the Code of Best Practice, in line with what we're saying in terms of the research output policy, that we would like to up the quality of journals. And how do we up the quality of these journals? Is through these rigorous peer review expert panels that we constitute. and that we review and we give back expert opinions. It's not the ASAF Secretariat, so we do not sit and pick on what is it that we would like to criticize the journal on. So I hope that stresses the importance of the work that we do at ASAF and the evaluations. It's a mammoth and a huge operation that we conduct to advise and to assist journals. I would really like to put out the invitation to editors on this call is to say that we will help, we can advise, we can help, we can look, and please make use of that opportunity. I'm not sure, Naomi, if you want to pop in and perhaps just relate your experience with our peer review panels, because it is a reflection on our panels, but I just want to state it very clearly. It is experts that evaluate your journals and say, but this is wrong. We want quality research output, and we have to ensure that we up that quality. And again, you saw on my table, there's not always quality in the South African journals, considering, again, that we've been there for 14 years. So what has happened? We have to do that analysis, that gap. And we're still not there where we want South African journals to be. Thank you, Eagle.
Over to you, Naomi, if you'd like to respond.
Yes, just to say, Susan is very right. We got feedback from the panel for our journal, I think early last year, and we have been working to implement those recommendations. And that's why I can say confidently that our journal is doing better. I think one of the things we value with what ASAF does is that the people that sit on those panels are, first of all, experts in the field, and also those recommendations are made with goodwill. So nobody wants to just trash your journal and say you're not doing good work. They do actually acknowledge the good work that we do, but they say you can do better by doing 1, 2, 3. So we took it as goodwill for the journal, and then we worked on that. So a body like ASAF is crucially important, and we do value. I think every journal article, every journal editor or team of editors should value the feedback they get from ASAF. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great. I'd like to move on to a slightly different question. This is in connection with open access, and it comes from Joy Papier. I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. This is about free to read but pay to publish and the major problems around the article processing charges. First of all, I'd like to ask each of the panel whether they charge article processing charges, and then I'd like Susan perhaps to drop something in the question and answer box that might provide a reference for this. Article processing charges are a major problem for authors and for South Africa at the moment. SANLIC, the Library Consortium, is negotiating with journals, but I would like to hear the editor's point of view. If I may begin with you, Professor Mark.
Thank you. So I think that's an important question, and our journal is, there are publication fees and for the author, and that is the model, that's the only way this journal can be sustainable. For us, the alternative is advertising, which we don't want. And the publication charges are hopefully reasonable for South Africa compared to international publications. I don't know of any other mechanism that our journal could be published actually in a reasonable way. It is an important question, and I'm interested to hear other viewpoints and hope to learn something from that.
Professor Naomi?
Yeah, that is tricky for me because our journal doesn't charge publication APCs. I know a lot of journals do, especially journals that are run by like non-profit organizations, and I do belong to one of those. So they do need that little money to keep the journal going. But it's not an exorbitant amount, and in most cases, universities can often cover this in using your research funds. I tell you what, Internationally, the APCs are exorbitant. And I can give you a very simple example. I had an article accepted from Routledge Journal in January, and they were charging, I wanted the gold open access, they were charging $4,130. That's about 80,000 rands, South African rands. And it is totally impossible to pay that kind of money. From where? From which resources? I know South African journals are not that exorbitant. And maybe I stand to be corrected. I think usually the page fees you pay are really minimal amounts.
Thank you very much. Professor Albie?
Yes, I must just tell you that both the journals that I've been editing for, 25 years, we've tried this sort of home industry model. And with one of the persons of ASAF, we actually got hold of a really nice company in a small town that helped us. But let me tell you, the work and the responsibility of doing everything according to the code and thinking also of the legal consequences should one slip up somewhere. We in the end decided to go for a commercial open access publisher, and I have much more peace of mind. But when I see in the list of manuscripts that are in editing but are not getting published soon enough, I get hold of the manager at the office of the publisher, and I said, do you think that this person might have financial problems? And then I get hold of the person, and then if needed, and I think this is perhaps not the best model, but if needed, and the article is good, and the person is a novice person, and she hasn't built up her DHET savings money, research and publication trust fund, then I take it from my own research and publication trust fund, because this is really a good piece and it should get published, and it should get published now. It's happened very rarely that I did that, but I do think that to have an organized publishing house or a press like UNISA Press, where they do good work, and where there's a history of journal support, it costs money. There's another South African journal where the cost is about half of what our journal asks. But they don't do anything for you. Nothing. They just say fix up. So I'm very much for it, but I'm also very much for it that we must try and get a national fund for new authors, especially the new authors in fields that are critical. And I think we all think our fields are critical, but let me tell you, if children don't learn and get taught well and have good materials in the first few years of school, their future is already bleak. So we're going to try again to get some funding to support authors, to give them some respite from paying the full fee, which for our journal is quite expensive. It's 1,000 Rand per published page, not per typewritten page.
Thank you very much. May I recommend that all editors present consider making contact through USAF, University South Africa. I know that the chair, Professor Ahmed Bawa, is very much in favor of a national fund. I do also know that many universities run a fund for article processing charges. I also know that for a natural scientist to publish in Nature in 2021, when I last looked, was about $11,000, which can take a toll on any funds that you might have established and puts it out of reach of the early researcher. Thank you very much indeed for that. I'd like to take a question. Does the journal or the publisher have the mandate to deal with authorship issues? Is there anyone on the panel who would like to answer this one straight away?
Can I answer?
Yes.
The publisher will ask the editor, please advise, and then act accordingly. That's what we do.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Then there's a comment The discussion from Professor Naomi shows the need for the editorial team and the editors-in-chief to be subject specialists to be able to make a judgment on what is not publishable or to reject. And I believe we can answer that straight away. Yes, that's right. It's the responsibility. Professor Naomi?
Absolutely. You have to be a subject specialist to edit the journal in the first place. I mean, what would I be doing editing a journal in chemistry? I'm editing a journal in my field. African literature is what I do. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. And if the editors don't have the specialist knowledge, they can find it. Susan?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. Yes, just a little bit to heed some caution, not to pass everything onto your editorial advisory board for peer reviewing. I think that's the benefit of also using external people to peer review, is to broaden your base, especially, sometimes you cannot have all the experts on your editorial board, and you have to go outside, if I can put it that way, to peer reviewers to review. But again, it is a good practice then to broaden your base of peer reviewing to ensure that you will publish some quality work and get some input also from the outside. Otherwise, one also have to be careful that it doesn't become sort of just an in-house activity, if I can put it that way. The best practices really prompts you and ask you to be open and to consult and to be wide. I know there's problems, and peer reviewers to solicit them is a huge challenge. So I do want to recognize that, but just best efforts to ensure and your end users, your readers and your authors, that you have consulted broadly. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'd like to take up another question from Joy Papier. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. What is the practice with regard to papers published from an unpublished doctoral thesis? Where is the acknowledgement placed? Or is it a footnote at the outset, and I'll add, or is it a reference? May I ask Professor Mark?
I'm not sure about that, but I am used to it being a footnote. Which that makes sense to me, and I'm happy to learn from other members of the panel or participants.
Thanks. Any other panel members?
May I?
Yes.
Recently somebody has submitted a paper to us, and that was in the acknowledgement that this paper emanates from a master's research or a PhD. So I think there are multiple ways of acknowledging that this paper is coming from a thesis or a dissertation.
Okay, thank you. Any other comment from the panel?
I've got one comment, and that's at our university, and I think most that I know of, there's one can do PhDs, for example, through publication. And I just think that's the best way forwards, to publish your work, because if you don't publish it, it's lost. So so it's just a plea for people to actually publish in peer-reviewed journals as well as getting their theses.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to move on to a question that's come in from Johnny Maseko Peterson. How do we prevent being abused by writers who refuse to update their manuscripts after receiving detailed feedback? It's probably done to await a decision not to publish them.
Yeah.
They might send their updated manuscript to another journal. And this is a very interesting question because Johnny Maseko Peterson is from the National School of Government, a very pertinent question. And is there someone on the panel who'd like to take this one up?
I'll just start and say that we would reject it. If one thinks that the article does have merit, to contact the author and say, look, this is what you have to do, and if the reviewers suggested important things for you to do, please consider it, and if you can do it, you can resubmit. But that's sort of a line that is an important one to me anyway.
There are still many open questions, but we only have about 8 minutes to go. And Naina Amin or Nina Amin asks for comment on the practice of citations for articles published in predatory journals. Should authors be instructed to purge those citations? What if the DHET has not removed those journals from their list? Anyone like to take that up?
I could perhaps
Okay, you go first. Okay, that's a very tricky question, because you really don't, we really need to uphold the image, the reputation of our journal. So you don't want to publish a paper that has got a series of predatory citations. I think one of the things I do as an editor is to identify clearly which ones come from predatory journals and let the author know that these are from predatory journals. Can you substitute and use something from other journals? But, you know, like we say, it takes a lot from the editor to take time and check. I think because my discipline is pretty small, I kind of know the articles, but it may not be the case for others. But I think really, rather than risk having those, you want to tell the author, this is not acceptable, please change.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to one from Blanche Pretorius. Should it not be the author's responsibility to have their work language edited before submission? And I'd like to supplement with my own question. Should the editor not just send this back and say, please have a professional language edit before you resubmit? Who would like to take that up?
May I?
Yes, please do,
yes.
Professor
Okay.
Elby.
I did respond in the question and answer section, but I have to say that there are only so many language editors who know the academic language of a field and who understand the transitions between sentences and paragraphs in a very special way. And I think it's very difficult. I often receive from student work, but also at the journal, I get the certificate. This person has looked at it. She is an official language editor. But I know full well, after having read only the introduction, that I will have to go through the whole article and actually undo some of the stuff that the editor had done, because she does not understand the nuances and the possibilities of what this could mean in the field. And that's why I say a journal editor and the section editors and the reviewers have to be people who know the field. I've got a quick anecdote. I was once looking for an editor to examine, because I couldn't find one. We had 12 no thank yous. And then eventually I looked at various people publishing in this field. And by luck, I found a university in Jordan, where I'd never looked. And there I found a few gems who specialize in this field and who, on top of it, have a dual language background. So I think, and that's something that I'd like to say now, in case there's not much time left later. The work of a journal editor, especially if you have many manuscripts coming in, is a really tough assignment. It takes up a lot of time. And I think academics who work full-time, like myself, although I have more choice because I don't teach, I do this research chair thing, that it should not be underestimated how much responsibility you have, how people's futures, their promotion, their income may depend on the care that you give to one article. And that's why I think our hardest piece of work is not much of what we've talked about, but it is about getting the right reviewers and to persist until you have them. And that's the commercial publisher which publishes our journal, has a manager for our journal who is just excellent. She brings us 10, 12 new reviewers every week because she also searches. And I think we need to realize that academic publishing is like universities, much as we don't like it, a little bit corporate. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Those remarks are remarkable. There are many burning questions still open, but I'd like to raise one comment from Professor Karen Hoffman at WITS, who can't be here. She says the conflict of interest in articles must be clearly stated and it needs to be part of the agreement signed with the journal. I know that conflict of interest, this is Igor speaking here, is already in the Code of Best Practice, but Professor Hoffman says editorial teams and reviewers need to be aware of a new trend of industry interference in science, where companies are paying researchers to write articles that favor their industry or distort the evidence. And Professor Hoffman is in the field of pharmaceuticals for diabetes and sugary beverages, processed foods, the alcohol industry, etc. She has sent me a link which I can't place in the chat box, but it is in connection with the skinny jab. If one is to Google revealed experts who praised new skinny jab received payments from drug maker. I think that the responsibility of the scholarly community is being drawn to the attention of all editors here. So we have about minus a minute to go, and I'd like to wrap up. Apologize to those whose questions haven't been answered. Suzanne, may I check whether it is possible for those in the chat box to be taken up and perhaps answered by an email or by a typed answer, if we could keep that open?
Yes, indeed, Igor. The session is being recorded, so the remaining question answers will also be recorded. Certainly, we will take it up with the different authors. Thank you.
With huge regret, then, I'm closing with a summary. Thank you so much for putting forward so clearly in essentially a letter with the editors, which the recording of this session is, the role of the Code of the Best Practice, the integrity in scholarship and quality assurance, balancing scholarly, academic, political, and financial interests. The journals from the South are being questioned by the world. We do have a responsibility as the scholarly community there. Thank you, editors, for the very difficult role that you are playing, and it's a voluntary role, largely. There is a need to reconsider the Code of Best Practice. I advise you all to read it through again and make comments if you wish. What has been most useful has to do with the state of scholarly editorial practices. Thank you so much for your summary, Susan, which is available here. A strategy can be very beautiful, but it is useful to look at the results. Action is definitely needed. We now know that. We have together focused on the language of publication and English as a language, although diversity is very much recognized among the journals of the South. And the correct use of scholarly language within the parameters of the journal. I think it was Mark Twain who said, I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I've written you a long one. The process involves scholarly education of the community and builds trust in the scientific process. I do think that there are concrete proposals on the table for the continued education of authors, not just young authors. I certainly need education as an elderly author, if I can put it in that way, in good language, in concise language. And the action of editors is in the scope of educators. This is almost the next place that you learn after your PhD or after a degree. We all have a major responsibility in ensuring scientific integrity. And I do think that the weekly meeting of editors plays a very high role there. The level of the research and engagement in the research question is often lacking and needs attention. Reviews of reviewers at all levels is always an uncomfortable process, but a welcome one. And we've talked about the role of, we've talked about sustainability from the point of view of both editors and in terms of article processing charges. And how to consider cases of need, which is done by some of the journals. So thank you very much for your collective your collective wisdom. I see all sorts of cheers and thumbs up from people around the screen. Thank you so much for your participation. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. And thank you to Asaf for making this an open and collective process. So thank you very much, everyone. A last word.
Thank you.
From Professor Elby. You are muted.
My video is on, but the sound went off. I'm so glad that you can see I'm real, I'm me.
That's
Great.
wonderful. We're glad to have you on board. Thank you to everyone, and thank you to Asaf for this forum, because it really is a working forum.
Thank you, Igor.
The recording will be available.
Bye.
Cheers and
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye. Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Take care.